Thank you very much, and thanks for inviting me as well. So, as said, I will speak about the risk ranking that we have done at the Swedish Food Agency and the approaches we developed. And this, you can say, has been more formal activity since 2014. We also had a risk ranking project together with the Finnish Food Authority that was partly funded by EFSA, where these approaches have been further developed. The report from that project was published early 2023. And in this presentation, I will overview a little bit the approaches for chemicals that we have developed, and also speak a little bit about how we've used some of those approaches since the EFSA funded project ended. And basically we have, you can say, developed three type of approaches for chemicals, for risk ranking of chemical hazards. And they, you can say, differ in terms of their complexity and data requirements, but they are based on the same underlying idea. They used it, you can say, traditional chemical risk assessment, risk characterization framework as a starting point, and as one important point, they added severity consideration to that. And this set of approaches, A, B, and C, are now also together with other methods proposed as part of EFSA's new guidance on risk-benefit assessment. I mean, that relates to quite a lot, I think, to also risk comparison and risk ranking. That's part of it, at least. So these three approaches, I will mainly speak about the more simple approach that we call the risk thermometer, which is illustrated on top. That's a more, you can say, pragmatic approach, which it attempts to standardize the health-based guidance value developed, like it's already daily intake, developed for a chemical by making a severity adjustment of that. So the output from this approach is called severity adjusted margin of exposure. I will talk a little bit more about this, but I also want to show you the other approaches that are connected to this. More, like to say, you can say they are more. There we have explored more fully the underlying idea. So in approach B and C, that is an approach that attempts to integrate toxicity data beyond the critical effect. In the B approach, for example, as illustrated in the figure, the different dots there are, in this case, so-called benchmark doses for different effects. We try to rank these different effects according to their severity on the y-axis. So you have milder effects at the bottom and more severe effects like cancer on the top. And you have a model that tries to summarize this. So this particular, and you can evaluate this model illustrated by at some exposure level, illustrated by the vertical red line there, and calculate the probability in this case of exceeding different reference doses for different effects across this severity domain. You can also try to integrate that. A more generalized version of this approach also you can also use to calculate the probability or integrate the probability of effect rather than exceeding some reference value for an effect. The C approach is we used a similar type of model, but to summarize, it's an attempt to adapt this approach to you can say the future chemical risk assessment. Here we don't speak so much about severity, but we try to summarize data from, in this case, data from gene level data at the gene level. You can also calculate benchmark doses describing such type of bioactivity measures, and here we have tried to use the same model to kind of summarize information for a specific chemical in such type of short-term studies. I will not go in so much in detail on these more advanced approaches, but just to show you that there is a set of approaches that we developed that kind of are linked to the same underlying idea, but they require more or less data. So I wanted to talk a little bit more about the risk thermometer. It's illustrated here in more detail. As I said, it basically involves making the severity adjustment of the health-based guidance value for it to reflect, at least conceptually, a mild effect. And the metric here we call severity adjusted margin of exposure. So it's the severity adjusted or adjusted HGBV, health-based guidance value, divided by the exposure. The exposure here could be a mean exposure from the food, or some percentile, or even a distribution of exposures for that particular chemical. And the So basically, this is just an extension of the typical way of doing chemical risk characterization, where you compare the exposure in one way or another to a reference value. Here we also add the severity consideration. So we have developed a health effect classification scheme, which is C1 to C5. And you can say that represents the broader take on the dose makes the poison. So at C1, you start to see some change in some, let's say, unspecific effect or marker. At C2, it's the same thing, but for an organ-specific marker, and then organ damage, then some disease, and then something even more severe than disease. When you start to see changes in these type of effects, so it's a form of you can say toxicological idea behind the setup of the scheme. But then we also attach severity factors to each of these categories. This is, I think, where also risk assessment meets risk management. So when we developed this approach, we also had risk managers involved in the project, and they kind of have, you can say, cleared the weighting values, these actual values of the severity factor. As you see in this illustration, we have also the severity adjusted marginal exposure. I mean, you have the concern increases as this value becomes lower and lower. And this scale is also divided in different risk classes, 5 different risk classes. This is also a form of risk management, I would say. What one could do is that if you want to modulate the importance of the severity factor, a simple way to do that is to basically multiply this range of factors 1 to 100 by a new factor in order to compress this scale, or even expand it if you want to this severity factor to or system, this part of the approach to be more or less important compared to the default setup. I've also illustrated here the case situation for cadmium. I've plotted here, indicated the EFSA health-based guidance value, EFSA TDI for cadmium. That's based on the underlying effect. There is a change in the kidney marker that would classify at C2 in the system. So then you divide that by a factor 3.2 in order to arrive at this adjusted HGBV. And the gray bar you see in the figure that illustrates the severity adjusted marginal exposure when you consider the exposure here in terms of the average cadmium exposure in the adult European population. So that ranks here classifies in risk class 3. And you can compare this just to illustrate how this works a little bit. If you compare this to the case similar type of exposure situation or exposure measure for lead, you see that ranks higher in terms of how the exposure relates to the reference values. Is pretty much the same situation. For cadmium, you see that the exposure is slightly below the EFSA TDI, and also for lead, you see that the average exposure is slightly below the reference point for lead, but they rank differently in this system because the effect underlying the reference point for lead is more related to kidney disease than change in the kidney marker. So here, more or less, the other parameter, the other aspects are somewhat similar, but the effect underlying the health-based guidance value is different. So this is illustration a little bit how it works. I was also going to say a little bit about how we've used the risk thermometer since the EFSA funded project. In the end of that, we had started to the risk thermometer started to be part of a scoring approach for determination of the food control program for contaminants. So that actually happened almost before this project. That project ended, but we have since then also it's been used to support prioritizations with the residues control. So this has been a gradual increase in how this approach directly affects part of the food control at the food agency. And this then involves prioritizing food chemical combinations. What I showed you previously, we've often used this in the past to assess how the total exposure from food, what the situation is with that, but you can also adapt this to apply to rank food chemical combinations. Also, we have quite recently finished a drinking project related to drinking water. This has been in collaboration with the Swedish Agricultural University. It was financed by Swedish Water, and the question here was if the risk thermometer could be used as a tool to help water suppliers to monitor the recurrence level, assess or browse the need for chemical barriers. This report is ready, but it's not yet official, so I am not able to show any results. But this was, I think, an interesting also application. We have also used the risk thermometer within the recent so-called Swedish market basket study. And I'm able to show you some results from there. This report is also not yet published, but will soon be that. So these are in technically you can call this as preliminary results still. We have, I mean, market basket, the Swedish market basket study is you can say study that we do every 5-7 years. It involves calculating a rough exposure estimate, but for quite a large range of different components, both vitamin, minerals, and undesirable substances. And this is based on we consider the most important foods in terms of the most purchased foods. So it doesn't cover all foods, but the most frequently purchased foods, and we do chemical analysis of that with respect to a lot of different components. So you obtain a form of, you can say, rough exposure estimate, the per capita exposure estimate, which is a form of represent, you can say, some form of average adult exposure, and you get that for a lot of different components. We applied and did risk ranking also using this tool in the previous one, but this time we managed to do this for 69 chemicals. And the difference here was that we also generalized the approach to assess the health concern associated with not only access but also deficiency. So basically, we kind of also turned the risk thermometer system in the other direction to assess for some chemicals the gradual, let's say, increase in concern with too little intake. So it basically just turned the system around. In the end, in this table, we have still kind of adjusted the value. So when the severity adjusted marginal exposure becomes lower, it becomes worse. So we kind of standardize the scale still in that direction. But for the but in any case, we kind of have in this way generalized the approach. So normally in past we have only in the previously we only kind of assessed this for chemicals like contaminants or similar with health-based guidance values, but now it was extended to also be used for chemicals with upper tolerable intake limits and also the lower tolerable intake limits. In the case of the LEs, we have kind of turned the system in the other direction. So these are the input parameters are taken, these limit values, HGBV, upper limit, lower limit, were mainly taken from EFSA. The severity consideration regarding the effect underlying these values were determined in-house. And then we have this rough dietary exposure, estimate of dietary exposure per capita exposure. And as you can see, we have 5 different risk classes, and sodium and dioxide compound ranked highest. A number of compounds also in risk class 3, and most of them in the lower risk classes. Historically, we have the Food Agency, you can say, have regarded risk class 3 as a form of gray area, where it could be interesting to look a little bit into the issue in more detail. Risk class 4 then is more like more clear that perhaps you'd like the exposure to be lower. What can be said more generally also is that it seems like for compounds with lower limits, but they were underrepresented in the higher risk classes, perhaps indicating that the access was more a problem than a deficiency overall. Okay, and a little bit looking ahead, this pragmatic risk thermometer, we have discussed if we could perhaps integrate, update the metric there. We use a marginal exposure metric. Perhaps it could be better to be able to speak about the probability or something, and also in that sense, update the interpretation of the risk classes. We speak about concern there as you traditionally do in terms of when you do chemical risk characterization, but perhaps you can also have update that if we manage to change the, let's say, metric. So this is some ideas we have. Also this, I mentioned this project with the related to drinking water. There were some interest, I think, from the water supply. So it could be interesting to see further investigate the usability of the tool in that context. Then I haven't talked so much about the kind of the further development of this approach for beyond consideration of multiple effects, but there are a number of things that I think can be further considered. one thing is if the outputs from those models could be also taken to some form of health impact assessment or development of disability adjusted life years or similar. So this is something that perhaps will be looked into, and also those analysis also involves quantitatively integrating probabilities across different effect categories. And you have weights there. How important are they, and how much will the result change depending on weighting? You also have issues with correlated uncertainty. Some of that is illustrated, and a small analysis of that is actually done as part of the EFSA guidance on risk-benefit assessment in the appendix, but I think that has to be much more studied, and also how you can apply this approach to kind of more newer toxicity data. So there are a number of issues there I think that can be further investigated. So I was just going to conclude with these 2 points here, that my experience is that a more comparative risk assessment provides a pretty good link to risk management. As I've said, this is reflected by the fact that we have a better link, a better impact in terms of helping the food control. Also, some years back, we did an assessment of arsenic and rice, and the Food Agency developed dietary advice there, which are quite directly coupled to results in scenario analysis that we did with risk thermometer. So I think this provides a great link between risk assessment and risk management in those examples. And also, the last point there, I think relates a little bit to what you discussed in association to the previous presentation and asked Jamie about. I think that the concept we have could probably benefit from development of some international agreement regarding how to do effect classification, at least in some form of general way. So I think that certain parts of the risk ranking approach, so to speak, could benefit from some international harmonization, and this is an example of that. And with that, I will conclude my presentation. So thank you.